Alright, this is part 2, still on chapter 1. Or, sorry, not chapter 1, we're still on part 1. No? Yeah, no. Okay, so this is still chapter 1 of part 1. Alright. Yes, I know, it's a lot. Alright. The Olympics. More than 350 women and girls accused of the USA Gymnastics national team Dr. Larry Nassar of molesting them under the guise of medical treatment. Structural flaws in the governance of both the Olympics Committee and sports governing bodies have resulted in a hands-off approach that puts the priority of winning medals, not protecting athletes. Professors, rates of sexual abuse and harassment in the academic science are second only to the military. It's estimated that at least half of women faculty and staff face harassment and abuse and that of 20 to 50% of women students in science, engineering, and medicine are abused by faculty. According to Julie Lebarkin of Michigan State University, about 30% of the harassers have been investigated on more than one occasion. The fact of being investigated did not deter them from harassing again. Corporations. For many firms, paying fines for sexual harassment have been treated as a cost of doing business. In the past 7 years alone, from 2020 to 2017, the U.S. companies have paid out more than $295 million in public penalties over sexual harassment claims. Thousands of Google's employees walked off the job in offices spanning from California to Dubai in protest of the company's handling of sexual harassment claims. Over 60% of Google's offices around the world participate in walkouts. Hollywood. I can tell you that the number one problem in Hollywood was and is and always will be pedophilia, says Corey Feldman. There was a circle of older men surrounded themselves around this group of kids, and they all had either their own power or connections to great power in the entertainment industry. Feldman addresses the dark side of pal Michael Jackson that led to their estrangements and warns of the growing and not shrinking dangers of internet-era child predators in Hollywood, a place where adults have more direct and inappropriate connections with children than probably anywhere else. There are a lot of vipers in the industry, says Elijah Wood. People who have their own interest in mind. There is darkness in the underbelly, if you can imagine it. It's probably happened. Public schools. A 7-month investigation by the Associated Press found that 2,570 educators whose teaching credentials were revoked, denied, surrendered, or sanctioned from 2001 through 2005 following allegations of sexual misconduct. Young people were the victims, and in at least 1,801 cases, and more than 80% of those were students. At least half of the educators were punished by their states, also were convicted of crimes related to their misconduct. Most of the abuse never gets reported. Those cases reported often end with no action. Cases investigated sometimes can't be proven, and many abusers have several victims. A year-long USA Today network investigation found that education officials put children in harm's way by covering up evidence of abuse. keeping allegations secret and making it easy for abusive teachers to find jobs elsewhere. As a result, school children from across the nation continue to be beaten, raped, and harassed by their teachers, while government officials at every level stand by and do nothing. Congress passed a law in December 2015 requiring states to ban school districts from secretly passing problem teachers to other jurisdictions or face losing federal funds. But 45 states have not instituted the ban. According to a 2017 report founded by the U.S. Department of Justice, an estimated 10% of K-12 students will experience misconduct by a school employee by the time they graduate from high school. According to Terry Miller, Executive Director of Stop Educator Sexual Abuse, Misconduct, and Exploitation, the culpability of a teachers' union in this particular issue is long, deep, and far-reaching as you can imagine. From your local school director politics to Capitol Hill, you have unions obstruct too many good pieces of legislation on this issue at the state, local, and federal level. Being more accountable than... Reading how the teachers' union have obstructed justice makes the Washington Post look enfeebled when it commends public schools for being more accountable than the Catholic Church in combating sexual abuse. Sexual abuse in the media. The media in general do not have a sterling record in dealing with sexual misconduct. Charlie Rose, Matt Lauter, Glenn Thrush, Mark Halperin, Leon Wieseltier, Hamilton Fish, and Michael Orikes are just some of the big names who have been accused. When 4 female journalists accused New York Times reporters Glenn Thrush of sexual misconduct, there was no independent investigation. The probe was done in-house. Dean Beckett, the executive editor of New York Times, explained that the paper's reaction, while we believe Glenn has acted offensively, we have decided that he does not deserve to be fired. Instead, Beckett allowed Thrush to undergo counseling. This is not an indefensible position, but it smacks of hypocrisy when the same newspaper demands that bishops contact the authorities when sexual abuse allegations are made against a priest. Why is it okay for the Times to handle sexual misconduct cases in-house, but not the Catholic Church? And why does the newspaper lambaste bishops for relying on counseling when the newspaper itself relied on counseling to deal with one of its own offenders? It really gets embarrassing when we learn that the same year Glenn Thrush was plunged into hot water, 3 women accused Michael Orikes of sexual harassment. 2 of the alleged incidents occur in the 1900s when Orikes was the Washington, D.C. borough chief for the When Orikes was the Washington, D.C. borough chief for the New York Times. At the time, Jill Abramson, who would later become executive editor of the Times, was deputy to Orikes. She said that she knew of his allegation offenses but did nothing to stop them. The Boston Globe had a similar case. In March 2017, a young woman employee filed a complaint with Human Resources against a male journalist. She said he propositioned her to have sex with his wife. but nothing came out of her complaint. A year earlier, she accused the same man of asking her to go to bed with him. She was allowed to stay on the job until more accusations were made against him. He was allowed to stay on the job until more accusations were made against him from outside the office. Who was he? The Globe refused to say. Who was he? The Globe refused to say. They declared this to be a confidential personal matter. Globe editor Brian McGrory admitted he would be accused of hypocrisy, but so what? I can live with that far more easily than I can live with the thought of sacrificing our values to slake the thirst of this moment. Whatever happened to honesty, consistency, fairness, and transparency? What about fidelity to the law? Under the Massachusetts law, sexual harassment in the workplace covers both verbal and physical conduct. The law explicitly says that sexual advances and requests for sexual favors constitute as sexual harassment. While the Globe cut slack for itself, it was a relentless critic of the Catholic Church's handling of sexual abuse. At the time, I detailed 12 instances in which the paper's editorials hammered the Church for its code of silence, veil of secrecy, and lack of transparency. I criticized McGrory for the Laura Ingraham on Fox News show, The Ingraham Angle. In the end, he issued an apology for the way he handled the matter. In many cases of sexual misconduct in the workplace, the guilty party is at least suspected by many of his colleagues, and in some cases, virtually everyone knows what is going on. And this is particularly true when the abuse is serial in nature. In such case, it is preposterous to think that only a few are aware of what's going on. This is true for priests as it is for media executives. Les Moonves is the former CBS chief who saw his career take a nosedive once his predatory behavior became public knowledge. Journalist Kyle Smith claimed everyone around Moonves knew what he was doing. They all knew. The men knew, the women knew, the potted plants certainly knew. Nobody said anything. They didn't want to jeopardize their next gig. A report prepared for CBS by outside lawyers verified Smith's report and found that many of the company's employees, including high-ranking executives and even members of its board, were aware of the former chief executive Les Moonves' alleged sexual misconduct and subsequent efforts to conceal it. Why didn't 60 Minutes turn the cameras on itself? It is very good at aiming them at the Catholic Church and do a segment on Moonves. Maybe it's because longtime executive producer Jeff Fager was himself a predator, and he was fired in 2018 right after Moonves was canned. Fager may have been Fager? It might be Fager. Fager may have been sacked sooner had the Washington Post done its job. In 2019, it ran a searing editorial against the bishop, accusing them of exercising all but absolute authority over investigations of abuse. What makes this editorial dishonest is that it was printed at the same time as Washington Post editor Marty Barron was using his all but absolute authority to kill a story about Fager's acts of sexual harassment. Amy Brattain, the newspaper investigative reporter in Erin Carmon, spent 4 months doing a story on Fager. It was followed up to November 2017 piece about Charlie Rose, who was fired from CBS after sexual abuse claims were made. The reporter spoke to several women who alleged that Fager had sexually abused them. Barron, they said, kept delaying the story and refused to speak with them. When the story finally ran, the allegations against Phaedra were deleted. Only additional allegations against Rose made it into the print. Why did Washington Post kill the story on Phaedra? According to one of the reporters, Cameron, who wrote about this sordid case in New York Magazine. One of the reasons had to do with the ties between the newspapers and Phaedra's show. The close relationships between the papers and 60 Minutes had something to do with it, he said. Had it not been for the exercise Had it not been for the exercise of Barnes' all but absolute authority, it is likely that this story would have run. Moreover, the favoritism shows to the colleagues that the paper frequently accuses the bishops of practicing was also on grand display. In 2017, NBC fired Today Show host Matt Lawyer after a detailed complaint about inappropriate sexual behavior in the workplace had been made against him. The NBC then conducted an investigation of this and other allegations, which concluded that while the accusations were credible, there was no widespread or systematic patterns of abuse at the NBC. Linda Vester, a former network news anchor, blasted the investigation, saying they had damaging details about Lawyer and others in management who had allegedly protected him. Nothing happened. She said the problem is right at the top of NBC. Why did Andy Lack, the chairman at NBC, not let this get out? Is it because he himself has a history of reported sexual misconduct in the workplace in the past, and so he himself is guilty? Or is it because he wanted to protect other high-profile men in the company? The New York Times has also protected its top people when the head of the BBC, Mark Thompson, was slated to become the new president and CEO of the New York Times company in November 2012. He immediately came under a cloud of suspicion. A decision had been made nearly a year earlier at the BBC to kill a Newsnight investigation into what became the most astonishing sexual abuse scandal in the history of the United Kingdom. The person of interest was accused child rapist and the serial predator Jimmy Savile, a celebrity icon who worked at the BBC from the 1960s to the mid-1990s. Thompson, who was the Director General at the BBC from 2004 to 2012, denied wrongdoing. Savile was Britain's first disc jockey. He was also a television host, wrestler, dance hall manager, cyclist, marathon runner, book reviewer, Mensa member, and a child rapist. His most popular gig was hosting the Top of Pops in the legendary UK music show. His own program, Jim'll Fix It, lasted almost 20 years. It allowed him to make promises to kids he tried to fulfill. Unfortunately for a lot of these kids, Jimmy fixed them all right by using them to fulfill his sexual appetites. He preyed on minor boys and girls, both children and adolescents. He did so in his car, in his BBC dressing room, his hospital wards, and in the bedrooms of girls at boarding schools. He did this for decades with impunity. Thompson started working at the BBC in 1979 when Savile was raping minors on BBC property. During my time as a Director General of BBC, Thompson said, I never heard any allegations or received any complaints about Jimmy Savile. That would certainly make him unique. Bill Donohue, a former actor, said everyone knew within the BBC about Saville's preying on children. He spoke sarcastically about Thompson's alleged ignorance. You worked at the BBC and you don't know anything about it? Don't be ridiculous. P.D. James, the famous crime novelist, agreed. It seems everyone knew about Jimmy Savile. No sooner had Thompson made his profession of ignorance when the BBC's own press office contradicted him. On the same day, October 7th, 2012, it was reported that the previous December, Thompson was warned by an angry senior journalist about the potential consequences of axing the Newsnight investigation. On October 24, it was reported that a respected BBC foreign correspondent, Caroline Hawley, also spoke to Thompson at the Christmas party about this issue. She said she was informed of the broad context of what happened. Thompson said that he recalled hearing somebody about this but didn't ask for details. On November 16th, it was reported that 10 days before Thompson left the BBC in September, his lawyers wrote a letter to the Sunday Times in London, threatening to sue if they decided to go forward with a detailed article about Savile issue. Unavoidably, the letter summarized the accusations against the BBC icon, thus undercutting Thompson's claims that he never heard about Savile's serial sex crimes while he was running the BBC. Then, the most unbelievable defense of Thompson was raised by one of the former aides. The personal advisor said that although Thompson had personally authorized sending the letter, is not clear if he was shown it, but he doesn't remember reading it. But if he authorized the letter, he had to have known what it was about, and that's all that counts. The rich and powerful inside the media not only protect themselves, they sometimes shield their rich and powerful friends. Financiers and serial sexual predator Jeffrey Epstein is another case where everyone around him knew of his conduct, specifically a sex trafficking operation involving minor girls. According to journalist Vicky Ward, who profiled Epstein, his entire social circle knew about this and just blithely overlooked it. Ward also exposed Grayson Carter, editor of Vanity Fair, for deleting. Ward also exposed Graydon Carter, editor of Vanity Fair, for deleting from her story about Epstein allegations that he had sexually exploited minor girls. She said they had cut a deal, even though the allegations were credible. Sexual misconduct in politics. Finally, there is no end to the politicians. Both Republicans and Democrats who had been involved in sexual misconduct have been serious accusations made against them. I would like to share how my input brought justice to one offender. How much is left? 6 more pages. On August 31st, 2016, there was a front page story in the New York Post about Anthony Weiner, the former New York congressman who was married to Huma Abedin, a close friend of and advisor to President candidate Hillary Clinton. The article showed a picture of Weiner allegedly using his son as a chick magnet, to lure to lure sexual relations. I I immediately filed a formal complaint with the New York City Administration for Children's Services, ACS, the New York branch of the New York State Office of Children and Family Services. That same day, Daily Mail Online, a British media outlet, reported that an ACS spokesman said, in order to protect children and their privacy, ACS does not comment on specific cases or allegations of child maltreatment, regardless of whether or not allegations have been reported, are being investigated, or have not resulted in investigations. It came after Bill Donohue, the president of the Catholic League, urged the New York State Office of Children Family Services to investigate Weiner for sexually exploiting his young son. On September 22nd or 26th, I received a phone call from ACS. I was told that my complaint had been accepted and that Weiner would be investigated. The next day, ACS officially called to question me further. A week later, on October 3rd, FBI agents seized Weiner's laptop, phone, and tablet. On the laptop, which was used jointly by his wife, were emails between Abedin and Hillary Clinton found on her private email servers. Those emails were disclosed by the FBI Director James Comey right before the November election, an event Clinton said tipped the election to Donald Trump. If it did, she had no one to blame but herself. Had she not had her private server, the FBI would have had nothing to investigate. I obviously had no idea that my role in this drama would contribute to such a monumentous political outcome. Media bias. The media occasionally do a story on sexual abuse in non-Catholic organizations, though they rarely do documentaries or a series of reports on them. Their favorite target by far is the Catholic Church. What they produce is often skewed. Here is a prime example. When newspapers, magazines, TV shows, and internet stories cover sexual abuse by priests, they often do in the most graphic terms. This is also true of state grand jury and attorney general reports. Some of the stories are incredibly salacious, though when covering sexual abuse by others, readers and viewers are usually spared the details. This is not a mistake, it is deliberate. It's called shaming. Some media outlets have refused to sell me advertisement space in their newspapers and magazines that I wanted to use for defense of the Catholic Church. In 2011, when the Kansas City Star was relentless in its news story on clergy sexual abuse, I sought a corrective. I offered the newspapers $25,000 to pay for an advertisement that sought to set the record straight, especially about the work of Survivors Network of the Abuse by Priests, SNAP. I was denied without an explanation. Could it have been bias? It is not, though, that the paper could not have been used. It's not as though the paper could not have used the money. In the previous decade, it had laid off 1,000 employees. In 2013, the Philadelphia Inquirer went on a tear against the Archdiocese of Philadelphia, spewing a lot of misleading information. On May 14th, I submitted a long rejoinder to the paper's narrative. The 2-page article was scheduled to run on an ad on May 20th. On May 15th, I was told that those at the top rejected it. When I asked why, I was told there would be no explanations. They turned down $58,000, even though the newspaper had filed for bankruptcy in 2009. Those at the top thought turning down that sum was worth it. In 2012, The Hollywood Reporter and Variety both turned down ads I wrote about a TV show that smeared nuns. In other words, this is not an unusual occurrence. The media hold the cards. They can get their side. They can get their side of the whole story to the public, but those who seek to rebuke them, even if they offer to pay for it, good luck. It is one thing for the media to spin the story, quite another when it's totally distorts the truth. Distor- Quite another when it totally distorts the truth. That's what happened when the CBS Evening News did a hit job on the Catholic Church in 2003. On August 6th, it reported nationwide that the Vatican used documents in 1962, the instruction of on the manner of proceeding in cases of solicitation, which laid out church policy that calls for absolute secrecy when it comes to sexual abuse by priests. Anyone who speaks out could be thrown out of the church. The online version of CBS Evening News went further, saying that the orders to cover up the sexual abuse of minors were written in Rome at the highest levels of the Vatican. None of this is true. On August 7th, I appeared on CNN, Paula's on now, to discuss this matter. I held up a copy of the document on TV and charged CBS with lying about the newspaper. In 1962, document deals exclusivity with solicitations that a priest might make towards a penitent in the confessional. Contrary to the way it was reported, the document detailed penalties for the priest who, whether by words or sign, nods off the head, might convey sexual advance of the penitent during confession. The ultimate penalty from being bounced from priesthood was possible. The ultimate penalty being bounced from the priesthood was a possibility. In other words, not only was this document not a cover-up scheme, it was just the opposite. It was designed to deter sexual misconduct by spelling out penalties for any priest engaging in sexual solicitation in the confessional. Here's something else document made clear that CBS did not report. If the penitent were to tell somebody, perhaps another priest, about sexual solicitation in the confessional, the penitent had 30 days to report the incident to a bishop or face excommunication. If anything, this proves how utterly serious the Vatican was about such an offense. It threats to punish the penitent for not turning in the guilty priest. It is striking that most media outlets, including the New York Times, did not say a word about 1962 Vatican document. How, then, did CBS get it so wrong? Because it took its cues from some lawyers involved in the case against the church. Indeed, I identified 3 of them. They were the first ones out of the box, blasting the Catholic Church with their false allegations. And CBS took their bait because it was a bogus story. It died quickly, but much damage had been done. CNN issued a documentary in 2010 that was strewn with unsubstantiated allegations against Pope Benedict the 14th? 14th. No, wait, the 16th? For decades before he became Pope, said host Gary Tuchman. Joseph Ratzinger was a high-ranking Vatican official who, more than anyone else besides the Pope John Paul, could have taken decisive actions to stem the sexual abuse crisis. This was patently untrue. Not only was Ratzinger not in charge of this issue for decades, but he wasn't given the authority to police the sexual abuse problem until 2001. Astonishing, later in the program, Tuckman concedes as much. The most serious accusation against Ratzinger was his alleged handling of Father Lawrence Murphy, who is believed to have molested 200 deaf boys in Wisconsin in the 1950s. CNN did not say that the crimes alleged against Murphy extended to the 1950s, that the authorities were not formally asked to investigate into the mid 1970s, that the following a probe, the police dropped the case. Fast forward to 1996, the first time the Vatican was notified. The Vatican didn't care that the statute of limitation had expired. It ordered a trial. Father Thomas Burdage was the judicial vicar, the one who presides over the case between 1996 and 1998. When asked about Ritzinger's role, he said, "At no time in the case, at the meeting that I had at the Vatican in Washington, D.C., and in Milwaukee, was Cardinal Ratzinger's name ever mentioned," he said, and he was shocked when the media tried to tie Ratzinger to the Murphy case. Why didn't CNN report any of these facts? Perhaps it was willing to accept without question that the innuendo-laden commentary of attorney Jeff Anderson, who, according to his website, pioneered the use of civil litigation to seek justice for the survivors of sexual abuse. Had CNN been doing right by the story, it would have dug. Had CNN been doing right by the story, it would have dug deeper and told the truth about Cardinal Ratzinger. The Boston Globe in its national The Boston Globe in the newspaper that broke the sexual abuse scandal in the church wide open. It hammered the church for lack of transparency. Yet years later it proved that it had a hard time with transparency itself, and a matter of appearance to appeared to me as proof of bias against the church. On November 4th, 2018, there is a front page story in the Boston Globe alleging more than 130 bishops, or about a third of those still living, had been accused of failing to adequately respond to sexual misconduct in their dioceses. The news story, which was based on a study by reporters from the Globe and Philadelphia Inquirer, gathered national headlines. It was released prior to a conference of United States bishops who were meeting in Baltimore to discuss sexual abuse scandals. As a sociologist, I had some serious problems with the methodology of the study, and I also emailed the Globe about them. They were cordial, but it would not budge on my request to see data. That's right, the same newspaper that insists on total transparency on the part of the bishops, demanding that they fully disclose their internal data, would not make public its data on the bishops. What made the data suspect was the statement from the two newspapers that they had examined court records, media reports, and interviews with church officials, victims, and attorneys. What made me most suspicious were the interviews with church officials and attorneys. Based on past experiences, I doubted trustworthiness of certain defense attorneys, victims, watchdog groups, and media outlets. I wanted to read who the reporters chose to interview and what they said, but the beacons of transparency slammed the door in my face. Because I kept pressuring Brian McGrory, the editor of Boston Globe, asking if he would allow me to verify the story. He pitched my request to Scott Allen, assistant managing editor for projects. When he denied me access to the raw data, I asked for permission to at least read the transcripts of the interviews that were conducted. Again, I was turned down. Allen said we don't circulate our interviews unless we plan to publish them. That's understandable, but the effect of its policy in my case was the suppression of potential criticism. It cannot be said too strongly that although many in the media have been unfair to the church and hypocritical in their censure, there would have been no Scandal 2 without Scandal 1, molesting priests and their enabling bishops. That can never be slighted. Many of the bishops lacked fortitude, one of the cardinal virtues. They should have had the courage to do what was right, not what was expedient. Scandal 1 and Scandal 2 are both of the outcomes of people's violating another cardinal virtue, justice. The injustice committed by molesting priests who violated the cardinal virtue of temperance, and their enabling bishops who violated the cardinal virtue of prudence, has left a big scar on the victims, on the church. They need to be held accountable. The Catholic Church, however, is a force for greater good, which is why those bent on damaging it from the inside and the outside need to be held accountable too. There's just too much at stake not to. That's the end of chapter 1 of part 1.